Assemblée générale,
On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency, Mr. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, President of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I invite him now to address the Assembly.
In the name of God, the compassionate and the merciful. O God, hasten the arrival of Imam al-Mahdi and grant him good health and victory.
O God,
make us
hasten
his followers,
the arrival of Imam al-Mahdi
and
and
those
grant
who
him good
attest
health and victory, and
to
make
his
us his
rightfulness.
followers and those who attest to his rightfulness.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased and grateful to the Almighty to have the opportunity once again to attend this important universal forum. In the present tumultuous world, and with the predominance of loud outcries, threats and tensions, and at a time when the big powers are unable to solve present problems, when mistrust in regional and international arenas is on the rise, when the psychological security of societies is being targeted by an onslaught of political and propaganda designs, and disappointment prevails over efficacy of policies and actions of the international organizations in the establishment of a durable peace and security, and the protection of human rights is being weakened, I plan to touch upon and explain the roots of and the ways out of these predicaments and some of the principal challenges facing our world. I will also speak to you about the need for remedying the present situation, prospects for a brighter and more hopeful future, and about the appearance of the sublime and beauty, compassion, and generosity, justice, and blossoming of all the God-given human talents, and the prominence of faith in God and realization of the promise of God. I will then submit to your judgment the nuclear issue of Iran as a reality and testing ground for the measurement of honesty, efficacy, steadfastness, and accomplishment. In the closing part of my statement, I will offer my proposals. Dear friends and colleagues, as you are all aware, mankind is currently facing important, numerous, and diverse challenges, and I will refer to some of them. 1. Organized attempts to destroy the institution of family and to weaken the status of women. Family is the most sacred and valuable human institution that serves as the center of the purest mutual love and affection amongst mothers, fathers, and children, and as a safe environment for the nurturing of human generations, and a fertile ground for the blossoming of talents and compassion. This institution has always been respected by all peoples, religions, and cultures. Today, we are witnessing an organized invasion by the enemies of humanity and plunderers to destroy this noble institution that is targeted by promoting lewdness, violence, and by breaking the boundaries of chastity and decency. The precious existence of women as the manifestation of divine beauty and as the peak of kindness, affection, and purity has been the target of heavy exploitation in recent decades by the holders of power and the owners of media and wealth. In some societies, this beloved human has been reduced to a mere instrument of publicity, and all the boundaries and protective shields of chastity, purity, and beauty have been trampled. This is a colossal betrayal of human society, of succeeding generations, and an irreparable blow to the pillar of social coherence, the family. 2. Widespread violations of human rights, terrorism, and occupation. Unfortunately, human rights are being extensively violated by certain powers, especially by those who pretend to be their exclusive advocates. Setting up secret prisons, abducting persons, trials and secret punishments without any regard to due process, extensive tax...
We now leave the UN General Assembly to return you to the Senate. We plan to bring you the speech by the Iranian president in its entirety later in our program schedule. Lawmakers are returning now after...
They prosecute scientists and historians for stating their opinions on important global issues. They use various pretexts to occupy sovereign states and cause insecurity and division, and then use the prevailing situation as an excuse to continue their occupation. For more than 60 years, Palestine, as compensation for the loss they incurred during the war in Europe, has been under occupation of the illegal Zionist regime. The Palestinian people have been displaced or are under heavy military pressure, economic siege, or are incarcerated under abhorrent conditions. The occupiers are protected and praised, while the innocent Palestinians are subjected to political, military, and propaganda onslaughts. The people of Palestine are deprived of water, electricity, and medicine for the sin of asking for freedom, and the government that was freely elected by the people is targeted. Terrorists are being organized to attack the lives and property of the people with the blessings of the politicians and military officials of the big powers. The brutal Zionists carry out targeted assassinations of Palestinians in their homes and cities, and terrorists are decorated with medals of peace and receive support from the big powers. On the other hand, they gather a number of Jews from different parts of the world through false propaganda and with the promise of providing them with welfare, jobs, and food, and settle them in the occupied territories, exposing them to the harshest restrictions, psychological pressures, and constant threats. They prevent these people from returning to their homelands, and by coercion and propaganda, induce them to malevolence toward the indigenous Palestinian people. Iraq was occupied under the pretext of overthrowing a dictator and the existence of weapons of mass destruction. The Iraqi dictator, who had been supported by the same occupiers, was disposed of, and no weapons of mass destruction were discovered. But the occupation continues under different excuses. No day passes without people being killed, wounded, or displaced, and the occupiers not only refuse to be accountable and ashamed of their adventure, but speak in a report of a new market for their armaments as a result of their military adventure. They even oppose the Constitution, the National Assembly, and the government established by the vote of the people, while they do not even have the courage to declare their defeat and exit Iraq. Unfortunately, we're witnessing the bitter truth that some powers do not value any nation or human beings, and the only things that matter to them are themselves. their political parties, and their groups. In their view, human rights are tantamount to profits for their companies and their friends. The rights and dignity of the American people are also being sacrificed for the selfish desires of those holding power. 3. Aggressions against indigenous cultures and national values. Culture is the manifestation of identity and the key to the survival of nations and the foundation for their interaction with others. In an organized movement, indigenous cultures that are messengers of monotheism, love, and fraternity are being subjected to broad and destructive aggressions. National customs and values are humiliated, and the self-esteem and character of nations are ridiculed and defamed. The purpose is to promote blind emulations, consumerism, skepticism toward God and human values, and the plundering of the people's wealth by big powers. 4. Poverty, illiteracy, healthcare issues, and the gap between the poor and the rich. While a major part of the natural environment in Asia, Africa, and Latin America is being plundered by the political and economic domination of certain powers, the situation of poverty and deprivation is very alarming. Let me draw your attention to some data issued by the United Nations. Every day, close to 800 million people go to bed hungry, and about 980 million suffer from absolute poverty, with less than $1 a day in purchasing power. People of 31 countries, equivalent to 9% of the world's population, have an average life expectancy of 46 years, which is 32 years less than the average of developed countries. The gap between the rich and the poor in some parts of the world has increased by 40 times. In many countries, the majority of the people are deprived of access to education and schooling. In developing countries, the maternal mortality rate during pregnancy is 450 per 100,000. This ratio is 7 in the richer nations, and the ratio of mortality of new births is 59 for developing countries and 6 for the richer nations. 1/3 of deaths in the world, or 50,000 persons daily, result from poverty. I believe this data clearly demonstrates the tragic situation dominating economic interactions in the world. 5. Ignoring noble values and the promotion of deception and lies. Some powers sacrifice all human values, including honesty, purity, and trust, for the advancement of their goals. They propagate skepticism and deception in the relations between states and peoples. They lie openly, level baseless charges against others, act contrary to legal norms, and damage the climate of trust and friendship. They openly abandon morality and noble values in their relations with others and substitute selfishness, supremacy, enmity, and imposition for justice, respect for others, love, affection, and honesty. They sacrifice all the good things and the sublime in life for their own greed. 6. Violations of rules of international law and disrespect of commitments. Some who were themselves the drafters of international law openly and easily violate it and apply discriminatory policies and double standards to others. They drafted disarmament regulations, but every day test and stockpile new generations of lethal weapons. They frame the Charter of the United Nations, but show disrespect to the right of self-determination and independence of sovereign nations. They conveniently abrogate their formal treaties and do not yield to laws concerning protection of the environment. Most of the violations of international obligations are committed by a few global powers. 7. Escalation of threats and the arms race. Some powers, whenever their logic fails, simply use the language of threat. The huge arms race casts a shadow of threat over the globe. The nations of Europe were the victims of 2 world wars and a number of other devastating conflicts, and were subjected to the consequences of the Cold War for many decades. Today, they are living under the shadow of the threat, and their interests, security, and lands are endangered under the shadow of the arms race imposed by certain big powers. A bullying power allows itself the right to set up a missile system, makes the life of the peoples of a continent bitter, and lays the ground for an arms race. Some rulers who superficially appear to be powerful believe the tools they have at hand can be used at any time and for any purpose, and consequently threaten others and cast a shadow of insecurity over nations and regions. There are international organizations and mechanisms clearly lack the capacity to overcome problems and challenges, to put in place fair and just relations and peace, fraternity, and security. There is hardly any government or nation that places much hope in these mechanisms to secure its rights or defend its independence, territorial integrity, and national interests. Dear friends and colleagues, there are many more challenges than the ones I have enumerated, and I know that one would have introduced more if one had wanted to touch upon them. But I chose to confine myself to the ones I have stated. Now the important and decisive question concerns the roots and causes of these challenges. A scientific and careful analysis shows that the root of the present situation lies in 2 fundamental factors. Without doubt, the first factor lies in the relations arising from the consequences of the Second World War. The victors of the war drew the roadmap for global domination and formulated their policies not on the basis of justice, but for ensuring the interests of the victors